Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's December 4th, and we have a lot to talk about. First off, we should acknowledge what feels pretty much like a win. Last year, when I launched the RealTalk MS podcast, I actually moved up the launch date by a couple of weeks because I wanted to talk about a vote that was about to take place in the U.S. Senate to repeal the Affordable Care Act. As every single patient advocacy group, including the National MS Society, had advocated against the repeal of the ACA, I wanted to use the podcast as a platform to mobilize people affected by MS in the United States to contact their senators and ask them to oppose the repeal of this really important piece of healthcare legislation. Well, that vote in the Senate turned out to be historic, and that particular effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act was defeated by a single vote. What we didn't know at the time was that this was just the beginning of a concerted effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act and eliminate the protections that were guaranteed under the law for people living with pre-existing conditions like MS. Now, I try to keep our conversation on the podcast as nonpartisan as possible, but the reality of this particular situation is that the Republican Party had made it their mission to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Unfortunately, their efforts would have made life worse for people affected by MS and every other chronic medical condition. So over the past 15 months, you've heard me rant about various efforts in Congress to pass legislation that would have a negative impact on people affected by MS. And all of those rants had one thing in common. I asked you to get involved and advocate on behalf of your own interests. I tried to remind you that our voices have power, and I invited you to be an MS activist. And that brings me around to the win that I want to share and celebrate with all of you. Last month's election created a dramatic change in the balance of power in the U.S. House of Representatives, and the day after the election, reporters asked the Senate Majority Leader, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, about the status of his efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Well, Senator McConnell replied, quote, "I think it's pretty obvious the Democratic House is not going to be interested in that." Instead, Senator McConnell suggested that Congress address the flaws in the Affordable Care Act, quoting again, on a bipartisan basis. And in politics, that's as close to a surrender as you're going to get. If you're someone living with MS, then you know all too well that we don't have much control over some of the things that come our way in life. At the same time, there are times when we can choose to take action, and our action can absolutely influence the outcome of events. I don't believe for a moment that we've heard the very last of repeal and replace when it comes to the Affordable Care Act, and there are actions that are already being taken that are designed to undermine the law. But make no mistake, it was our active participation at the polls on Election Day. It was our active participation that lit up the phone lines to our elected representatives in Congress, and it will be our continued active participation in advocating on our own behalf that will continue to make a difference in ensuring that our healthcare laws are strengthened and made better rather than repealed. So let's take a moment to celebrate the win and then put our MS activist hats back on so that we can go to work ensuring that everyone has access to affordable prescription medications and affordable quality healthcare. My guest on the podcast today is Dr. Larry Sherman. Dr. Sherman is an important voice in MS research, and we're going to talk about some of the breakthrough research that Dr. Sherman and his team have been involved in, We'll also talk with Dr. Sherman about his very unique research lab. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Larry Sherman, there are a few other things that you should know about. While we're still on the topic of celebrating the wins of MS advocacy, you might remember that this past September, Congress finally funded the National Neurological Conditions Surveillance System. We talked about it on the podcast because ever since 2016, when this program was authorized by Congress, MS activists had been lobbying for the necessary funding to pay for it and get it off the ground. And now that the funding is in place, the CDC, that's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they announced last week that they'd launch the surveillance system by studying data for multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease. These two initial studies will serve as demonstration projects to help the CDC determine the areas of greatest impact for neurological conditions. It's expected that the National Neurological Conditions Surveillance System will collect data on MS incidence, age, race, ethnicity data, geographic data, all of which is going to help scientists better understand multiple sclerosis and some of the environmental factors that impact MS so that they can refine and better target their research efforts. And that's how a legislative win translates into a real-world win for people affected by MS. So make no mistake, our advocacy matters. Our impact as MS activists can be seen, it can be measured, and it can absolutely help to reshape healthcare in ways that make a real difference. If you haven't yet signed up, you can be an MS activist. You can find a link in today's show notes to the MS Activist section of the National MS Society's website. The European Medicines Agency has approved Jelenia for treating young people who are living with MS. This makes Jelenia the only disease-modifying therapy that's been specifically approved for treating pediatric MS. Children and young people experience MS relapses 2 to 3 times more frequently than adults. And earlier this year, the results of a phase 3 clinical trial showed that Jelenia could reduce relapse rates by 82% in pediatric MS patients. Growing up is hard enough without having to deal with MS relapses, so gaining EMA approval can be a game changer for young people who are living with MS. And while the safety of Jelenia was tested as part of a clinical trial, just last week we told you about a new warning issued by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. They announced that MS symptoms may severely worsen after stopping treatment with Jelenia. Now, the FDA warning mentions that this disease worsening is rare. Their announcement points out that in the 8 years since Jelenia received FDA approval, there have been 35 cases of what they classify as, quote, severely increased disability accompanied by the presence of multiple new lesions that occurred 2 to 24 weeks after Jelenia was stopped. So that's one more very good reason why you always want to discuss potential risks and benefits with your neurologist before beginning any new treatment. The FDA has granted approval to Glenmark Pharmaceuticals to manufacture a generic version of Obagi in both the 7 milligram and 14 milligram dosages. Obagi comes in tablet form, and it was approved by the FDA in 2012 to treat relapsing remitting MS. Clinical trials demonstrated that Obagi was effective in reducing the incidence of MS relapses and preventing disease progression. And long-term studies have also shown that Obagi can slow brain tissue loss and improve cognitive outcomes. Now, generic drugs are manufactured with the same active ingredients as brand name medications, but because they carry much lower development costs, they're less expensive. Glenmark Pharmaceuticals is based in India, and the company currently distributes 142 approved generic drugs here in the United States. The company hasn't yet provided a date when generic Obagi will be available in U.S. pharmacies, but we'll keep you posted as that information becomes available. Albert Monero is a Fulbright scholar working on his doctorate in mechanical engineering at the University of Central Florida. And while completing work on an engineering doctorate can be a full-time pursuit all by itself, Mr. Monero has found time to launch a nonprofit company called Limitless Solutions. Now, Limitless is spelled L-I-M-B-I-T-L-E-S-S, and that's kind of important because Limitless Solutions takes advantage of 3D printing technology to manufacture prosthetic arms for children whose families can't otherwise afford the cost of traditional prosthetics. The company's already attracted the attention of Bill and Melinda Gates, and Monero traveled to New York recently to demonstrate Limitless Solutions technology to representatives of the United Nations. Well, now, Limitless Solutions is working on a solution for wheelchair users who have limited use of their arms or hands. This new technology enables someone to navigate a wheelchair forward, backward, to the right, or left by clenching their jaw muscles in different ways. Well, this eliminates the need to have someone pushing a wheelchair, giving the person in the wheelchair a much greater sense of independence and providing an immediate improvement in their quality of life. Limitless Solutions says that the muscle flex patterns that are used to power a wheelchair are intuitive and easy to pick up, and people are successfully navigating through complex or crowded landscapes after just a couple of tries. If you'd like to find out more about Limitless Solutions' wheelchair solution, I'll leave a link to their website in today's show notes. If you listen to Olympic athletes when they're interviewed, they'll frequently say that before they begin that gymnastics routine or run that race, they've already run it in their heads. Part of their training is learning about motor imagery, which involves imagining that you're doing an activity without actually doing it. And there's research to suggest that mentally rehearsing a physical movement activates the same areas of the brain as the actual movement itself. And there's also evidence to suggest that getting verbal cues or associating specific musical cues while someone imagines performing a physical task helps to reinforce the movements that are being visualized. Well, researchers at the Medical University of Innsbruck in Austria wanted to see if people living with MS could benefit from the same motor imagery techniques that are used by Olympic athletes, people recovering from stroke, and others. The research team conducted a clinical trial to compare the effect of motor imagery on walking, fatigue, and quality of life for people living with MS, and they wanted to compare using motor imagery that included musical and verbal cues with motor imagery that didn't include any musical or verbal cues. So the study involved 59 people living with MS-related mild to moderate disability. The 59 participants were trained in motor imagery, and then they were asked to use motor imagery at home 6 days a week over the course of 4 weeks. One group of study participants listened to verbal descriptions of taking an imaginary walk while music played in the background. The verbal instructions were matched to the rhythm of the music. A second group of study participants imagined taking a walk while listening to music only. They didn't receive any verbal cues or descriptions. And a third group of participants simply imagined taking that walk. They didn't receive any verbal cues or music. Well, the researchers measured whether there was any change in walking speed and walking distance, and they administered questionnaires to survey whether there was any change in fatigue or quality of life according to the participants. The study results show that motor imagery improved walking speed and walking distance in all 3 groups of study participants, and the largest benefit was seen in the group that received both verbal and musical cues. It's interesting to point out that the group that received the verbal and musical cues and the group that received the musical cues alone both reported an improvement in fatigue and in their overall quality of life. But the group that just relied on motor imagery without verbal or musical cues, well, they didn't report improvement in those areas. The study concludes that motor imagery with verbal and musical cues can significantly improve walking, fatigue, and quality of life for people living with MS. And if you'd like to learn more about this study, I'll include a link to the study results in today's show notes. Research is the engine that drives us toward better understanding MS, better treating MS, and one day, curing MS. I see MS research as a heartbeat of hope for a future where we talk about multiple sclerosis in the past tense. My guest on the podcast today is someone who plays a vital role on the front lines of MS research. In a moment, we'll talk with Dr. Larry Sherman about some of his most significant research and his most unique research lab. My guest today is Professor Larry Sherman. Dr. Sherman is part of the Division of Neuroscience at the Oregon National Primate Research Center at Oregon Health and Science University, where he specializes in investigating neurodegenerative conditions. In 2012, Professor Sherman was named the Teacher of the Year at Oregon Health and Science University Medical School, and Portland Monthly Magazine has called him one of the people who are changing our world. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Sherman.
Great to be here.
The Oregon National Primate Research Center is one of the more unique research settings. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's been around since the early 60s, and it was set up to be a resource for investigators who wanted to take their research kind of to the next level for translational studies. Things are going to go from the bench in the laboratory to the bedside eventually in patients. And having non-human primate models of disease was just a major goal for that.
So can you tell us a little bit about who lives there?
So in addition to quite a few scientists, there's about 4,000 monkeys there. The vast majority of them live in outdoor corrals and live pretty nice lives, actually. They're rhesus macaques. And then the animals that we study for our multiple sclerosis research are actually Japanese snow monkeys, Japanese macaques.
Now, I know you and your team discovered a naturally occurring disease in monkeys. It's very much like multiple sclerosis in humans. Can you tell us a little bit about that discovery?
Yeah, so these monkeys are really quite amazing. They were a troop of snow monkeys living up in northern Japan in the Hiroshima prefecture. And there were about 55 of them, and they were raiding farmers' fields. And the farmers wanted something to be done about that. And thankfully, a primatologist found out about this primate center opening in some place called Beaverton, Oregon. And they rounded up the monkeys and put them on a plane and dropped them off in Beaverton. And they've been there breeding like monkeys ever since. And in about the mid-1980s, one of our veterinary neuropathologists, a fellow named Mike Axtelm, started seeing evidence of some of the animals developing this disease that looked very much like multiple sclerosis. And since then, other people, including myself and Scott Wong and others at the center, have been really characterizing this disease and really trying to understand it because we think it's a legitimate model of MS that just doesn't happen in any other animals other than us.
I know that perhaps equally important to the discovery was the discovery that this MS-like disease was somehow associated with a herpes virus. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes the association with the herpes virus especially interesting to the research community?
Yeah, so we think this virus may be triggering this disease, and it's only triggering it in a small number of animals that have what we think is a genetic liability to the disease. And we think the genetics, the liability, and this herpes virus may be acting very similarly in the monkeys as it might in humans to trigger disease. There's been a lot of discussion about the possibility that certain viruses can trigger MS, such as Epstein-Barr virus, which is also a gamma herpes virus, in humans that have this genetic liability. And that seems to be exactly what's happening in our monkeys, which is remarkable. In addition, we may have kind of a perfect storm in Oregon because Oregon, of course, doesn't get a lot of sunlight, and our monkeys live outdoors in this big open corral with lots of grass and everything. But like us, they're vitamin D deficient, and that's also been raised as a possible risk factor in MS.
Currently, I understand you're working on 2 research projects that are funded by the National MS Society. What can you tell us about them?
So the first one is ongoing work that's been started my lab way back in 2005 as a small pilot grant from the MS Society. where we found one of the signals we think that is stopping the brain from repairing itself in MS. It's basically a substance that builds up in the brain after an MS attack. And it probably is initially a good thing. It probably kind of limits the inflammation and all the other damage that's happening. But the brain's really bad about getting stuff out of itself. And this stuff accumulates over time and is linked to the inability of cells to repair and remyelinate demyelinated lesions, which is the big problem in MS. So we've been studying this for many years now, and we've just in the recently the last 2 years identified some drugs that kind of affect this process we've identified. And in mice anyway, it beautifully promotes remyelination and repair in mouse models of MS. The problem is a mouse's brain is really different from a human brain. And so we were so excited when we found out about these Japanese snow monkeys because we thought, okay, we've got a drug that works in the mice. Now, can we take it to a monkey that has a disease that looks just like human MS, or very similar to it anyway, and cure the monkeys? So we are just starting that process right now. Some of the funding is from the MS Society. Some of it's also from the DoD congressionally directed medical research programs. So that's one project. And then a second project that we've been doing is actually linked to the idea that some of these same molecules may be playing roles in the MS attacks themselves. And we are really right now trying to use drugs that are already sort of in clinical trials for other things to attack that process to see if we can have yet another option for people to limit MS attacks.
Oh, they both sound really, really promising. So we'll keep our fingers crossed as long as we need to. Now, I was about to say rumor has it, but I have it on good authority that it's a fact that you're quite an accomplished pianist. And this past fall, I know you appeared before a packed house along with opera star Renee Fleming to talk about how listening, performing, or creating music can have a positive impact on our brain health. So as a lifelong music lover, I'm not at all surprised at this. But can you explain a little bit the role that music plays in brain development, healing, and even protecting us from cognitive decline as we age?
So, yeah, this has become sort of my second hobby. I've been giving these public talks on various topics in neuroscience, and one of them is music in the brain. I love to play piano and force people to sing. It's a lot of fun. But, yeah, what's remarkable is there's all this data to suggest that, in particular, learning to play an instrument can do all sorts of things that actually influence brain health. For one, there's studies in children, for example, taking piano lessons saying that the more you practice, the more the white matter in your brain expands in volume. And that seems to be mostly more myelin, which is really interesting. So that's one area. Another thing is we know that just learning to play these instruments may also increase the connections between nerve cells called synapses. And so the more you practice, the more synapses you may be generating. And this seems to have a lot of benefits outside of just playing music. There's a woman who's a concert pianist. She was in the former Soviet Union and she escaped with her husband and unfortunately was diagnosed with MS soon after she defected and stopped playing the piano, but then decided she really wanted to try again. And she insists that just playing the piano helps her just feel better. And the fact that you can drive myelination to some degree by doing something like learning to play the piano makes you realize there may be something to all this. This music therapy may really have some incredible value for people with different types of neurological conditions. So I'm really thrilled by the data, and I'm really excited to share that. And that's also just a lot of fun to play the piano. So.
Well, thank you for sharing it with us, and thank you for taking a few minutes to talk with me today.
It's my pleasure.
Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. I always appreciate hearing from you, so I invite you to send me your suggestions for future episodes, questions you might have, or any feedback you might want to share. Send your email to John, that's Jon, at realtalkms.com. And if you're finding that Real Talk MS is a worthwhile listen, please share it with your friends and family. You can find the Real Talk MS podcast at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find the best podcasts. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.